Good morning. We are finally on Proverbs chapter 13. And here is where we start to go into the part of our exploration where we start to look at the idea of wealth and poverty as they are presented to us in the book of Proverbs. Thank you for joining me on another episode of His Generation Podcast. You're listening to His Generation Podcast, a weekly exploration to biblical truth as we explore the Word of God. His Generation Podcast airs every Sunday morning, so grab your Bible, and here we go. In Proverbs chapter 14, we have a couple of verses that start to build upon a theological perspective when it comes to wealth. One thing that we do understand in the Proverbs is that it emphasizes the attributes of diligence and working hard, and definitely shows the opposition of those attributes like laziness and folly. And so when one pursues those type of attributes in their life, that is the diligent part, you're going to find yourself prosper. And not only are you going to prosper financially, but you will also be prosperous into things that are a benefit not only to your family, but also to those that are around you, especially those in need. And that's some of the things that we'll bring out here in Proverbs chapter 13. Now, I'm going to be highlighting some verses that remain with that topic and skipping other verses. But what I want to do at the end of this is I want to present 7 points when it comes to wealth and poverty in the Proverbs. So starting in verse 4, the soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. Both of these have a desire, yet those determined will be satisfied because of their hard work in moving forward. And then in this verse here also too, the word for rich really means to make one fat, as in filled with physical sustenance. So it's a little different word than we're going to see in verses 7 and 8 as we continue on here. So in verse 7, it says this, there is one who makes himself rich, yet has nothing, and one who makes himself poor, yet has great riches. And according to Proverbs, what are the true riches? In fact, we've learned in previous chapters that rubies and precious stones cannot be compared to what wisdom offers. And we see that in chapter 3, verse 15. And the riches that comes from seeking wisdom are enduring riches mixed with righteousness, better than gold. Proverbs 8:18 through 19. So let's just hold this thought because we want to try to understand what are the Proverbs communicating to us when it comes to this idea of true riches. And we'll wrap that up as we get to the end of chapter 13. Verse 8, the ransom of a man's life is his riches, but the poor does not hear rebuke. Or in this case, think of it like a threat. The poor does not hear a threat. And the scenario is obvious. The scenario is kidnapping. That's what is being demonstrated here in the text. A rich man can be held for ransom, obviously, because he has money accessible in his abundance, whereas the poor are not in the same financial state. So they will be no profit for a thief to cause any kind of blackmail attempt or kidnapping or anything like that. Verse 11. Wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. The method of obtaining a desire, that's what we're seeing here. And this is an important life lesson. And here it's used by associating it to wealth. Why? Because in most cases, becoming wealthy is a long, drawn-out plan that requires diligence, hard work, competency, and determination. And, it's going to be a laborious work, basically. Also, this could be applied to such desirable life tasks as raising children or marriage or any kind of labor-intensive that's drawn out many, many years. That's what's going on in here. And this idea is expressed in the proverb 20:21, where it says, an inheritance gained hastily at the beginning will not be blessed in the end. Verse 18, poverty and shame will come to him who disdains correction, but he who regards a rebuke will be honored. Now, the word correction can also be interpreted as discipline. And discipline is the ability to focus and control oneself in order to complete a task set before them, regardless if other desires or behaviors seem more pleasurable. And those who stay focused in the pursuit, obviously, they get a reward. And those who neglect or let those things go get dishonor and consequences that follow. That's what's being said here in the proverb. 22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. The point being here, material wealth is temporary to its original owner. However, wealth in the hands of the good is used for its temporary purpose, providing sustenance for his family unit in this life. And on the other hand, the sinner's unrighteous gathering of wealth will eventually have its diminish to others who it was not intended for. And this thought falls in line with the Sermon on the Mount teachings where Jesus said, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Also, the attitude of the person with one talent in the parable of the talents, where we see there quoted in the New Testament, Lord, I knew you were a hard man, so I buried it. Of course, the Lord rebuked him and said, what? Take it from him and give it to the other with the 10 talents. So there's that idea duplicated again later on in the New Testament. Verse 23. Much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of justice there is waste. This proverb helps balance the proverbial perspective of riches by showing sympathy to the poor. Here, poverty is the result of some form of injustice. The idea is that someone worked hard and earned the material good, but then someone forcibly took it from the hard worker. And most proverbs relate laziness to poverty, yet the balance is knowing there are poor folk that fear God. And just because one is poor doesn't mean that it's done because of lack of diligence. And that's what's perfect in this verse, because it shows sometimes it's a societal injustice of why that person is poor. And that's the bigger idea for verse 23. So far we have here verse 4, verse 7, verse 8, verse 11, verse 18, verse 22, and verse 23. And those are the verses that really encapsulate this idea of wealth and poverty. They build a good picture of how you should think with wisdom when it comes to that topic. And so with that, I have 7 points that I want to present. And hopefully this is a good start as we continue on through the rest of the Proverbs and start to see verses that are very similar to this when it comes to wealth and poverty. So the first point is, God blesses the righteous with wealth. Now we learned in chapter 3, verses 9 through 10, where it says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your increase. And so your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. Now, if one honors the Lord with their wealth, the Lord will use you as a vessel of material provision for righteousness' sake. And that's what we see there. And remember, in God's economy, you are not made rich for selfish reasons. So it's never for your own doing. It's for the subsistence, obviously, of your family and your generations after you. And then out of your abundance, you should be one that's giving to others that lack. That's the basic idea of having wealth and knowing this is how it works in God's economy. Point number 2, foolish behavior leads to poverty. What is the most common foolish behavior we've learned so far? Well, it's laziness, or the slack hand from chapter 12, verse 24, where it says, the hand of the diligent will rule, but the lazy man will be put to forced labor. And other behaviors have been covered too, such as greed and robbery, wasted time, false worry, things like that. So that's point number 2. Foolish behavior leads to poverty. Point number 3. The wealth of fools will not last, nor ultimately protect them. And we see this in chapter 11, verses 4 and 8, where it says, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. And then in verse 18, where it says, the wicked man does deceptive work, but he who sows righteousness will have a sure reward. And we also get a taste of this observation in verse 11 in our text, where it says there in verse 11, wealth gained by dishonesty will be diminished, but he who gathers by labor will increase. And then we go to point number 4. Poverty can be the result of injustice and oppression, not just laziness. And for that, our prime example, like I said previously, is going to be your verse 23 here in chapter 13, which says, much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of justice, there is waste. Point number 5, those with money must be generous. Proverbs chapter 11, 24 through 25 covers this point so well. And this is what it says. There is one who gives freely, yet gains more. But one who withholds what is due will surely become needy. Those who bless will themselves be refreshed, and those who satisfy others will themselves be satisfied. People will curse those who withhold grain, but blessing will be on the head of those who sell it. So those with money must be generous. Let's go to point number 6. Wisdom is better than the most esteemed wealth. And this is one of my favorite points because this is something we really need to dig deep into our abstract thinking to see how wisdom, although it's an abstract concept, has very much like tangible reward. And that reward has more of a value than the things that we value in our societal cultures, like gold and rubies and silver and things like that. Well, over and over again, this is mentioned in Proverbs. It is an important concept for mankind to perceive the value of godly wisdom. And the reason why I say godly wisdom is because sometimes we can get that twisted. We can think just because it's wise or sounds smart that it's wisdom, but we're talking about a wisdom with a quality of God's reflection and also, too, with the quality of righteousness, or should I say the outcomes of righteousness. The main point being, if one will subject themselves to the lifetime pursuit of money, which pays only temporal, false, and not guaranteed dividends, logically, if something better than it was available, wouldn't you rather invest the time pursuing that instead? Right, exactly. So, to the fool, or one who rejects God, this is an irrational thought. That's what's amazing. That's what we see here in our society nowadays. And then also lastly, let me give you this point. Remember what 2 ways you can tell what a person is all about. That's action and words. You might verbally agree with the proverbial viewpoint, but do your actions show what you really put your faith in? And that's what we need to think about when it comes to true wealth gained through wisdom and not necessarily this temporal or this corruptible type of wealth that we see in material goods. And then that brings us to our last point, which is point number 7. All material wealth has limited value, so use it with understanding. Verse 8 of our text says it well, and I would say it is the deeper understanding one can gather from it. And that says, the ransom of a man's life is his riches, but the poor does not hear the rebuke or the threat. And that's my 7 points for wealth and poverty as we see there in Proverbs chapter 13. Now, in the end, when it comes to wealth and poverty, personally, I appreciate the final word the book of Proverbs has to say about it in chapter 30. It says there in chapter 30, verses 8 through 9, "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you, and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and still, and profane the name of my God." For me, I understand my desire towards wealth can fluctuate depending on the season. And throughout those seasons, it brings balance. It brings stability to my mind. And is this not one of the benefits embracing God's wisdom to navigate through this life? I believe so. And lastly, I want to leave you with this quote from Paul the Apostle regarding material riches. He says there in Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." And let that be our prayer too, saints, as you enjoy this Sunday, the Lord's Day. May God bless you, and thank you for joining me on another episode of His Generation Podcast. Thank you for joining us at His Generation Podcast. To receive more information about the podcast, please visit our website, hisgeneration.net, or check out our YouTube channel, His Generation Podcast, for the video format of this broadcast. His Generation is a production of Generation Mars Media, located in Orange County, California.